Autism Quality of Life podcast, episode 6.
I started thinking, wow, this is a trauma event, and we're trying to teach kids new skills before we've dealt with that trauma.
Welcome back to another episode of the Autism Quality of Life podcast. I'm your host, Teri Krakovich. I'm really excited to share a bit about today's guest with you. He's been doing some very innovative work in the realm of autism treatment. Today I have with me Robert Cox from Life Recovery Consulting. Robert resides in the Kansas City, Missouri area and has a master's degree in counseling. He specializes in trauma, autism spectrum disorder, and addictions. He is in the process of finishing his book, The Life Recovery Method, Autism Treatment from a Trauma Perspective. Robert launched the podcast Listening to Autism on January 30th of 2017. Hi, Robert.
Thanks for having me, Terry. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, me too. There's some exciting stuff going on in the field right now, so.
There is. There certainly is. So would you mind filling in any gaps from that introduction and sharing a little bit more about you with our audience?
I've got about 24 years of experience in the field. I started out doing direct care as basically what they call a PA here, a personal assistant, someone who goes in the home. And there's a set of goals decided on by the team, the parents, the individual, whoever might be involved. And then my job would be to show up in their home and help them reach those goals, whether it was learning skills in the home or maybe communication goals or being out in the community to work on social skills. So that's how I started out. And then about 15 years of doing that, I actually finished my bachelor's degree late. I was perfectly happy just doing direct care, but I got married and there were financial pressures, so I completed the bachelor's and started working as a service coordinator, which gave me a whole different perspective on kind of developmental disabilities and what families were struggling with. And then at the same time started my master's degree where I wanted to major really and focus on trauma, especially trauma as it related to addictions. But I kept seeing in the research and the behavior of my patients through internship and things like that, things that really indicated that autism was kind of a trauma experience too. And that kind of led me down the rabbit hole as far as researching how the brain reacts to trauma and comparing that to how the brain reacts in autism. And I found just a ton of similarities. So that kind of really directed the next 4 or 5 years of my work.
Wow. So could you tell us a little more about how trauma has impacted your work with individuals with autism?
What I was seeing year after year, even from the earliest, one of the first clients I ever had, who had, at the time it was called Asperger's syndrome, and with the DSM-5 it's changed so that it's all on one very large, very broad spectrum. But he had a stimming behavior, which is fairly common. They call it flapping. He would shake his hands really fast, flap his hands. The push at that time, and this was, again, 24, 25 years ago, the push at that time was to help people fit in socially, right? That was the big push, was to get them to conform so they weren't social pariahs. So the best advice of the therapist at the time was, make him sit on his hands. Well, even then, that it seemed cruel to me because it seemed like, to me, the flapping was what was helping him calm down. And, I just could imagine with my own anxiety issues, if I didn't have my coping mechanisms, if somebody took those away, it would feel like my head was going to explode. And so even as early as that, I was noticing, we're going the wrong direction. And then, when I got into being a service coordinator, it was always the state was pushing for, okay, there are behavioral issues, it's autism, let's get an ABA in there and start, setting up a behavioral plan with the family, which is a great idea, but we know from kids in schools that deal with trauma, they're not going to learn if they're still dealing with that trauma, right? It's basic Maslow psychology that if you're concerned about your safety needs, you're not really concerned about how you're coming across in the world or other things. You need to get those safety needs met first. And so I started really looking at then in my research how sensory issues were assaulting people. I heard described over and over again. One of my jobs as a service coordinator was to write an annual plan, which meant sitting in meetings with people and interviewing them about what they were dealing with, so I could draw a really good picture for staff and other people that were going to interact with them on a regular basis to kind of read that plan and see, oh, this is what's important to this person. And what I heard over and over again was that these sensory issues would create very real physical traumas in their lives. So more than one individual I had would talk about they didn't want to take a shower. They didn't like showering because water falling on their skin felt like fire. And this is that basic kind of synesthesia experience where we get the senses mixed up in the brain. And so, the water feels like fire instead of feeling wet, right? And, we've all had some of that experience. We know that if we touch metal that's cold, we might mistake it for being wet because the sensation of cold and wet is very close, right? So it's that kind of thing times 100, And I repeatedly heard people describe, that when there's sensory issues, and I heard it described as it felt like there were ants all over my skin. It felt like my body was on fire. Aaron Likens is a writer and he lectures for the Easter Seals Midwest a lot. And he's an individual in his 30s living with Asperger's syndrome. And in his book, Finding Kansas, one of the things he talks about is that, and I went and talked to him after his lecture, was that the sensory issues would put him on such overload that it would feel like his whole body was on fire. That's a very, very traumatic event, and that trauma has real effects on the brain. And so that led me down that brain research path, was hearing that repeatedly. I started thinking, wow, this is a trauma event, and we're trying to teach kids new skills before we've dealt with that trauma, which makes no sense, really, from what we already know from Maslow about, needs, what needs need to be met first.
Yeah, so Robert, do you mind if I just ask you quickly here, in case some of our audience isn't familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Would you mind describing that in a bit more detail, please?
Sure. Basically, Maslow said that we have this, it's almost like a pyramid. If you were to draw a triangle or a pyramid, at the base of that pyramid are the safety and security needs, right? So things like food, shelter, water, the fact that we feel physically safe and we're not constantly being attacked by tigers, things like that, right, are the basic needs. And until we meet that need, we're not going to go up to the next need, which might be needs for employment, needs for family, needs for connection. And above that need would be the other until we get to the very top. And Maslow says that highest need for us is self-actualization, or, this spiritual connectedness, a sense of purpose, things like that. We're not going to care about any of those higher needs if we haven't met the basic needs. So, your listeners are very in tune with this idea in that it's very hard for them to concentrate on having fun with their kids if they're struggling to pay the bills. That becomes the primary concern, is feeding my kids, not whether I'm able to interact with them in the ways I would want to every day, right? So this is the basic hierarchy of needs. And as long as my physical needs aren't being met, or I feel like I'm being assaulted, I have no interest in learning new skills. I'm still focused on trying to stay safe in my world. And so that really led me down that, brain research area and looking at how these things affected the brain, how the brain in autism was already primed for that trauma response because of the overconnectedness of the brain, and the fact that the part of that overconnectedness creates damage in the area of sensory processing, and how there's a region in your brain called the amygdala that is responsible for your fight or flight. So every time you're scared, the amygdala takes over, and it starts secreting things like adrenaline and cortisol, which is like the corticosteroid that a lot of athletes take to improve performance. It increases heart rate, makes your senses even more hypersensitive than they were to start with. Really primes you to either run or pick up a stick and fight. And so the amygdala in individuals with autism, in many cases, is larger and denser than in the neurotypical population. So they're already primed for this kind of trauma response. So that's what started me down that path. It didn't make sense to me to put behavioral services in or teach social skills if we hadn't dealt with those issues first. And so direct treatment, I started to see, became very, very important. And it meant I was going to fight an uphill battle, because the way we've structured services in the States is to fund mostly ABA services for autism and not so much everything else, because we're stuck on the idea of evidence-based, except what we find when we go to the evidence, when we go to the research, is that if we start meeting sensory needs and controlling for this trauma, the need for the more expensive behavioral services goes way, way down, sometimes to zero. So we know, for instance, that with auditory sensory issues, behavioral issues really spike. They go up. Why? Because those auditory issues, I believe, are more painful for the individuals. Now, I haven't been able to research or ask individuals, to rate their sense of safety or trauma in the world based on what sensory issues they're experiencing, but we do know that for some reason there's a high correlation between auditory sensory issues and extreme behaviors.
Okay, would you mind sharing maybe a specific case example from someone that you've worked with, and how focusing on their sensory issues first and breaking through some of those internal and external traumas have impacted their treatment?
Sure, and luckily, because I have my book coming out, I've got permission from several people to share the cases that I've worked on and stuff. One little man that I worked with was developing fairly normally. They knew he had autism, but he was at level with things like language and school stuff until he was 5 years old. And then the sensory needs increased greatly. The sensory issues really spiked at 5. We know this happens frequently because of hormonal changes, right, as kids are growing. It's not uncommon at all for me to hear from parents that, God, my kid hit 11 or 12 and they went into puberty and then bam, everything changed. Many kids, I've heard things like they couldn't stand scratchy clothing, and then all they wanted was scratchy clothing. They couldn't stand soft foods, and then that's all they would eat. So it's not uncommon for those hormonal changes to also change sensory needs, and I think my theory is that is related to brain changes that go on during those times. But that aside, the young man at 5 went completely nonverbal, retreated into his own world because of sensory issues, and had been that way for 3 years. When I came to him, he was 8 years old. Extremely hyper, lots of sensory seeking going on, meaning he wanted to touch everything, he wanted to bounce on everything. Extremely hyper. He was sensory seeking everywhere, all over the place, all the time. But nobody had put any sensory diet or anything like that in place in the home. And Mom was, when I came in, very kind of suspect of me being able to make any difference, because she just had an ABA in there for 6 months, who spent the entire hour and a half, every time she was in the home, just restraining this kid, being bitten and kicked. And after a few days of that, I would be getting the hint that he's really not receptive to this, So my first 2 sessions I didn't even interact with him. It was mostly interviewing Mom. My interaction would be when he was hanging upside down on the couch or something, to look over at him and tell him he was a limber little monkey, and then he would giggle at me, and that was it. That was the extent of our interaction for almost 2 full sessions. Towards the end of the second session, he came over and sat down next to me, and I could see Mom tense up, because she's like, okay, this is the point where the therapist gets attacked, right? But all he did was take his hand and just kind of run it up my arm and feel the hair on my arm. And that was really, in my mind, his way of saying, okay, you're safe. You can come into my world now, right? And so that was my cue to start maybe asking him or inviting him into my world a little bit, so we could start training on how to deal with these things. Now, part of what I did that first 2 sessions in interviewing Mom was find out about sensory needs, right? And so we, through the Medicaid waivers, ordered a bunch of equipment that we could put in the home. And the apartment complex was kind of at first like, well, you're not going to change the structure of the home. And so I wrote a letter about ADA compliance, and we got all that straightened out. But it was, we're not putting like major holes in any walls or anything, but we needed to be able to hang some things and stuff like that.
Would you mind sharing a bit about how you determine what those sensory needs are? Is there a certain assessment?
I have a checklist that I have devised myself, which is much easier. I highly recommend the services of an OT. And I am not an OT. But what I do is send parents a checklist that basically says, okay, they like this or they don't like this. And that tells me about the sensory needs, what area they fall into. So we have, I'll review real quickly the types of sensory needs. There's the proprioceptive needs, which is basically difficulty with where I stop and the rest of the world starts, right? So I may be bumping into walls a lot. I may have real problems with depth perception, like a young man that I had that worked with, well, he was actually 19 at the time, and that was a long time ago. But he would on a checkered floor, he would only walk on the white squares because he couldn't tell how deep the black squares were, right? And he did not do escalators until we worked on that for like 3 or 4 months. And then that's all he wanted to do was escalators. So it was just this very much winning his trust and then inviting him into my world and going very slowly and remaining very mindful and things like that. So those are proprioceptive needs. Vestibular needs are like inner ear, right? They make you dizzy. Kids may try and adjust for those needs by spinning in circles a lot, hanging upside down a lot. Proprioceptive needs, maybe I like to bounce on trampolines a lot or bounce into things a lot. Vestibular needs are all about that kind of balance inner ear issue, right? Gravity works, kind of thing, right? I had a dog that labs are notorious for getting vestibular ear issues. I didn't know that until he could not walk. One day he would get up and he would fall down, and he'd get up and fall down, and I was freaking out thinking he had a brain tumor or something. So I called the vet. The vet said, no, labs have this issue. It's called a vestibular issue. And I'm like, well, I understand what that is. So I literally put him in a rocking chair and spun him around in circles, which he did not like, but he could walk afterwards.
Wow.
Because it reset that kind of inner ear problem that he was having.
Interesting.
We followed that up with some medication and stuff, but I knew from my work in autism what was going to work with him too, how we could reset that vestibular problem. And so this is what kids are doing when they're spinning in circles constantly, is they're trying to reset that vestibular problem they're having. So there's that, and then there are like auditory issues, sensitivities to noise, the taste issues. There are tactile issues. Some kids are sensory seekers, and they'll go and touch things because they are seeking, generally under-responsive to their sensory world. They're like the ones that will stand underneath a chandelier and spin in circles and watch the lights glisten for hours on end, or watch fan blades spin for hours on end because they're getting that visual sensory need met, right? So they're seekers. They're under-responsive to most sensory input. Now, there are other kids who are under-responsive that are so under-responsive they just have given up on trying to get the sensory input to come in. And they're the kids that are often seem very lethargic in classrooms, or it's just very hard to get them excited about anything, and they just kind of seem withdrawn in their own world. Those are under-responsive kids. They're not getting enough sensory input. It's very hard for them to. And then there are the over-responsive kids. They're the ones that have meltdowns because of the noise in Walmart or the crowds, right? Or they're the ones that if you put the wrong type of clothes on them, you're going to get a fit, a meltdown, that kind of thing. Those kids are oversensitive. They're hypersensitive to sensory input. So this little kid was a seeker for the most part. He was under-responsive, and so he was into everything. So we got some equipment that would help him, like a little spinny thing you could sit on and spin around for hours, and a sensory swing that he could get into, and it would cocoon around him and squeeze his body because he liked both swinging and deep pressure. And so we did these things and made some suggestions about how to implement a sensory diet. Now, you're better off having an OT for this, but I've had training and gone to workshops and stuff, and so I had a general idea of what was going to work for him. And we worked in conjunction with his OT at his school about what was working for him there, you see. So we really had this kind of team approach going. And then what I did with him was started teaching mindfulness, which is the next component for me. Once we start dealing with sensory issues, we start teaching mindfulness so that I've reduced the external input, or at least increased my ability to control it. And now whatever's left, I want to learn how to focus my attention elsewhere, right? So with this kid, he was fixated on gummies, loved gummies. And I don't know many 8-year-olds that don't like them, but he was really obsessed with them to where Mom had to hide them or he would get into them, right? So she got me a packet of gummies, and we created a mindfulness exercise with those gummies. And that was, we're going to sit, and we're just going to explore what shape is the gummy. Is it a type of animal? What color is it? How does it feel when I roll it around in my fingers? Is it really hard because it's been exposed to the air too long, or is it really soft and pliable? And what does it smell like? Does it smell like a cherry or a lime, or, he's not telling me anything at this point. But my deal with him is, if you give me the color verbally, then you get the gummy. Out of a package of 6, for the first time in 3 years, I got 3 verbal words from him: orange, green, and yellow. So he got the whole 6 because, that was pretty awesome. As a client he was very, very active, and I felt like if we started integrating some crossing the midline activities, which is going left, right, left, right, left, right, and doing some sensory integration and sensory enrichment stuff, right? So we've got music on in the background, and we're doing a dance where we're kind of like a patty cake game, right? We're touching right hand, left hand kind of thing. And there's maybe really good smell in the background. Like, we know that the smell of lemongrass or lemon smell really increases the flow of, like, serotonin in the brain. And so it's really good for your brain. That's why most of your calming, anti-anxiety, like, essential oils have some kind of lemongrass in them. The research is indicating, actually, that scent can trigger certain chemical flows in the brain. So we have that scent going on in the background, and we have some music that he responds well to that makes him feel good, and we have all this different sensory integration stuff going, and we're crossing the midline, doing right, left work. And what we're creating there is the ability for the brain to grow. And the research shows that when we do these things, that actually happens. The brain starts to rewire. And I have found in my own work that if we combine that with mindfulness exercise, the results are pretty amazing. I got a letter from Mom about 3 months ago. She actually posted on my Facebook business page that she felt like for the first time in years she had her little boy back. And when I was done crying, I thought, wow. And so when we can encourage this kind of right, left, whole brain integration, we're allowing that region of the brain to strengthen and grow. Just like you would a muscle if you went to the gym and you knew that your upper body was weak, you would work out your arms and your torso, right? A good deal of research out there that's showing that this actually works. If you go to a website called mendability.com, they do a lot of this sensory enrichment work with parents via Skype, and they have a good deal of that research available, some of it that they've done through their own work.
Oh, okay. So you can be sure to put that site in the show notes.
Yeah, it was actually Temple Grandin that turned me on to them when we met on the way out to the Autism Society's National Conference in Indianapolis. And we flew out together because she was here in Kansas City at a cattle convention. And she was headed there as a keynote speaker, and I was a speaker, and we spent a long time talking, and she said, you need to check these guys out. I was very impressed with them.
Great. Okay. So mendability.com.
Right. I don't know what they charge anymore. I haven't been on their site in quite a while, but I frequently refer parents that I think have the financial backing to that resource. When I met them years ago, they were trying to get together a grant program for people who didn't have the financial resources. So you might just reach out to them and see what they have to offer.
Okay. Great to know. So, Robert, what are you most looking forward to in 2017 now that we're entering this new year? I know you have a bunch of things coming up. You're launching a podcast of your own having to do with specifically trauma and autism. Can you tell us more about that?
I'm looking forward to getting that off the ground. My conceptualization is, and I have a Facebook group already directed towards this, is to create a supportive community of professionals and parents and individuals on the spectrum who really can talk about the issues they're dealing with and find support and resources in that community. So the Listening to Autism Facebook page is already created. I've got about 150, 160 members there. And they really are from all walks of life like that. A lot of parents in the Kansas City region, several individuals that I know that are on the spectrum there, and a lot of professionals from the field. And by professionals, I mean not just therapists, but, educators, service coordinators, case managers, people who are really familiar with the services that are necessary and have ideas. And so what I want to do is create that community and then strengthen it with the podcast by getting the word out there that, there is this supportive community that you can turn to, right, for help. And it's not just me giving advice to everybody. It's me inviting in all kinds of professionals to help support people. And then I hope to have in the next month the book finished and ready to go to press.
Wow. So
that by mid to end February, it's about a little over 2/3 of the way done now, but it's the most difficult 2/3 because the front end of the book is loaded with a lot of the research I'm doing. So I've got like 40 different research articles that I'm using there right now, just referencing because it's not just me saying, oh gosh, I think this would work. It's like, here's what the research says. There's no reason it shouldn't be working. So training some of these techniques is going to be a big goal of mine too. Training some of these techniques and talking to educators about changing their thinking a little bit, because I see a lot teachers who are they're awesome, they're caring, they're well-meaning, but they're just not getting what's going on completely, right? Because they see a kid with an IQ north of 160. We have a child who appears very neurotypical and is in many respects, but his executive functioning is still not working the way yours and mine does. And what that means is that he's not able to switch quickly from one task to another, right? So if I'm the teacher and I'm saying, okay, we're done with math, we're going to close our math books, or we're going to, get off the website for math and we're going to switch to English, it's going to take him longer to make that transition than it does the rest of the class. But if the teacher doesn't really understand that even though he looks neurotypical and acts in many cases more brilliant than many of his peers, he's still having executive functioning issues, then they're going to become impatient and think this is just a behavioral issue with him, right? Which in the case of the 9-year-old was creating some of those meltdowns in the classroom. Was the teacher's expecting me to do things I don't feel like I can do. I know I'm more brilliant than most of my classmates, but right now she's making me feel really stupid without meaning to. And so the other thing we did with him was we sat down with the teachers in an IEP meeting and we talked about giving him a little extra breathing space when we expected to switch gears. And that was very successful for him. Because again, it's about that ability to switch modes from A to B. Now, the other thing we know about mindfulness is that the research indicates it really improves executive functioning. In part because we train our brains to slow down. And we teach ourselves, just as an automatic response to that stress, to take a deep breath and force our brains to slow down. And then our executive functioning has time to catch up. Nobody would notice if he took an extra second of breathing time. What they notice is that his mind doesn't seem to be working and he's not coping with it well, and then he goes into meltdown. But if we work on training him to recognize those anxiety signals in the body, when I start to think I'm stupid and it feels that way, where do I feel that first? And the minute I feel that, I want to take a couple breaths and just slow down. We've already won the battle at that point. By making him slow down, by teaching him to slow down, even for a few seconds, he's gained the time he needs to allow his mind to catch up. And he's shut off the panic button that gets pushed so that his mind can actually do that more effectively.
Well, there's so much more we can go into about your work and future trainings. I really think this is such an exciting area, and there's a lot that our audience can learn from you. So where can they go to find out more about your work, about your upcoming book, and the launch of your podcast?
The Facebook group is Listening to Autism Support Group on Facebook. Then they can find me at liferecoveryconsulting.org or liferecoveryconsulting.com, either one. And they can email me at robert@liferecoveryconsulting.org. So certainly if they have questions, feel free to email me with those. And if I am not, I love research. So if I'm not sure initially, I'm going to have some fun and dig around in some research, try and find out. So
awesome. Thanks for giving out your email address. Really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Okay, so that would be Robert at liferecoveryconsulting.org. Okay. Before we wrap up, do you have any parting piece of guidance to leave our Autism Quality of Life community with today?
Well, especially for the parents, don't give up and understand that you're doing a lot better job than you think you are, probably. I walk into homes so often, I meet parents who are absolutely in tears because they love their child and they've tried everything and they can't make it happen. And it's just such a helpless feeling, And often by the time they get to me, they've been through 3 other attempts with other therapists and it's not working and it's frustrating. Just don't give up. Use a little. The other thing I suggest is, when I'm training a kid in mindfulness, I kind of suggest the parents start learning some of these techniques too, right? Take the time to practice your own mindfulness and learn to breathe through those difficult spaces, because you're going to be a much better and calmer support to your kiddo. And when you start practicing and they see you calming down, they're going to feed into that.
That's a great tip. Is there somewhere that parents can go to learn more about mindfulness? Do you have any recommendations or resources for the parents?
There's a site out there called soundstrue.com. And if you go on my website, you can go to mindfulness resources in one of the tabs there, and there's a link to soundstrue.com. They have lots of free resources and trainings and stuff. There's also several apps that are absolutely free. Stop, Breathe, Think is a free app available on every smartphone, and they're on the website, I think it's stopbreatheandthink.org or something like that. And they're a free app that will begin training you in mindfulness. There is an app that I use called Chill that I absolutely love because it just goes off on my phone at random 4 or 5 times a day and reminds me to do things like listen to your breath, take 3 deep breaths, or where are your feet right now, or what thoughts are going through your head at this moment. So they really keep me in touch with that mindful space throughout the day. That's a free app. I recommend, if you go to SoundsTrue, I highly recommend Eckhart Tolle or John Kabat-Zinn, or anything by Dan Siegel. His book, The Whole Brain Child, is brilliant.
Excellent. Okay, those are really great resources. We'll be sure to put those up with your website in the show notes, and then folks can go learn more about mindfulness there. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Robert. I really appreciate you taking the time to share more about your work today.
Thanks for having me on, Teri. It was a lot of fun.
Hi there. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you've gotten a lot of value from today's show. It would be great if you could share this episode with family and friends, and also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. To learn more about today's guest, you can visit our website at www.autismqualityoflife.com. Also on our website, you can find links to our social media pages and our YouTube channel. Sign up for the Autism Quality of Life newsletter to receive exclusive content and bonus interviews. Thanks again for joining us on our mission to improve quality of life for teens and adults with autism. We'll catch you next time.